Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm so grateful actually we're here. You know, it's been a really hard week for us, and I wanted to thank everyone for praying for us, because as you know, we live in Thousand Oaks, and so it's been a really crazy time between the mass shooting and then the next day followed by these crazy wildfires that, you know, came, you know, we actually had no idea. And surprisingly, we found out, we were at UCLA when the fires started, and someone called me and said, oh, are we going to still keep our appointment for tomorrow because of all the stuff going on in Thousand Oaks? And I was like, you mean the shooting? And they said, no, the fires. And I was like, what? So I got online and I saw it, and I went in and I interrupted the professor's class, and we grabbed everything and we ran home. So that night was really terrifying, because, you know, you're driving home and it's like apocalyptic. You know, the roads are weird, the feeling is weird, and we got ready to pack. We stayed up all night watching the news to see whether we had to be evacuated. And of course we were very scared because we had some really valuable books also in Thousand Oaks and some very valuable collections, and there's no way between that and the dogs and everything that we could save all of that. So of course then we started praying, the professor started praying very hard that God would try and spare, you know, would spare us. And subhanAllah, it's like everyone around us was evacuated, and we're in that little part of Thousand Oaks that was spared. So just to say, oh, can someone please let them out? Thank you. So just to say that, you know, this is a perfect example of the power of prayer. And because no one, you know, literally the fires were raging and coming in our direction, and you know, we have friends who like thought that they were leaving their homes and would never see them again. So, and still, please do continue to pray, because the winds have died down, but they're supposed to come back again tonight and for a few days. And that's the thing that's really tricky, is not knowing how those fires can jump in any direction. And truly, these are the things that, you know, only Allah can control. So it's so important to pray. And so many people have lost their lives. You know, the property is not that important, but even from the mass shooting, you know, no one had time to grieve before they had to start thinking about evacuating their homes. And, you know, Thousand Oaks, no one knew where Thousand Oaks was, and now the world knows. And so it's been a difficult time. But so I'm so grateful anyway that we were able to continue and have the halakha here. We felt comfortable enough that we could come and continue on. So anyway, I wanted to also just give you a quick update on some of the things that are available online now since our last meeting a month ago. And I sent an email out to some of the people, but we have a lot of new wonderful stuff that's happened since we last met. So I got up the Wellesley talk and also the talk at Harvard Law School that the professor did on reasoning with God, and you know, we'll definitely get into that a little bit more today as well. And then the professor had an amazing panel with Noam Chomsky and Chris Hedges, and it was incredible. So hopefully you have a chance to watch that. And then we have 2 khutbahs. The last one from last week, well, the first one was about the prohibition of torture, which was amazing, and then last week's was about the Muslim report card, which is kind of a view, an honest and painful view of what's happening around the world and what our responsibility is as Muslims. So it's a really important thing to watch as well. Meanwhile, also the professor had published an opinion piece on the Jamal Khashoggi incident. That's on the ABC Religion and Ethics website, so you can definitely find that there. And then we, as a preview, we actually have another opinion piece that is due to come out Monday and Tuesday in the New York Times. So also about what's happening in Saudi Arabia and all of that. So a lot of really good stuff. And then, oh, sorry, one more thing is we did a Q&A after the Noam Chomsky event, which was like an intimate event with the Muslims in the Bay Area, where I had a chance also to talk about, you know, converts and conversion, and we took like questions from the audience. And so that's also available online, and that was very special event. So we had a lot going on. It's just in 1 month. Not to mention teaching classes at UCLA and dealing with the fire and all this sort of stuff. So we definitely keep busy. So today we have an amazing guest. We have Professor Nader Hashemi. We actually have known Nader for decades, and he is an amazing person. He didn't want me to say very much, but I'm going to anyway, because you know, just so people understand like what a big name we have here. He's the head of the Center for Near Eastern Studies at the University of Denver. But we actually knew him from, I think, from the time you were a grad student even. So it's been a long time. And the thing that is actually, he really fell in love with this book, Reasoning with God, and wrote an amazing, I think, more than 10-page review for Reasoning with God in Critical Muslim. So you can find that online. You can also find it on our website at Search for Beauty. But so today is a really special opportunity where we're going to turn things around. This time, Professor Hashemi is going to ask Dr. Abou El Fadl about his book, and hopefully we can get some really amazing insights. So with that, so I guess we're going to go for about an hour or so, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Hashemi, and then we'll also make sure we have a chance to do some Q&A before we finish. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum to everyone, and particularly a warm assalamu alaikum to Khaled Abou El Fadl, my dear friend and someone who I consider an inspiration and a mentor. Just let me say something about the context that we were all passing through today. It's not an exaggeration to say that we are living in scoundrel times. These are the dark days of Muslim history, the age of surrender, of humiliation, of collaboration, punctuated by madness. When you look across the Islamic world today, it's a sea of darkness with maybe a little bit of light on the periphery of the Islamic world in Tunisia, and then in Malaysia and in Indonesia. And the recent event that has become a global crisis, I think, really illuminates and highlights the fact that we are passing through the dark days of Muslim history. And I'm referring, of course, to the horrendous massacre, or murder, more accurately, the horrendous murder last month in Istanbul of Jamal Khashoggi. And what that murder, I think, signifies and reminds me of is just the brutal nature of some regimes in the Islamic world today, political regimes, in this case Saudi Arabia, that were so arrogant and so drunk on power, thinking that they could just, not just assassinate a journalist, but then dismember his body, and according to the recent reports we're getting out of Turkey, to throw his body in a vat of acid and then dissolve it and think they can get away with it. And this just highlights the brutal reality of the Islamic world today and the nature of the regimes that we are confronting and suffering from. And so in this sea of darkness, in this land of darkness, in this age of darkness, Khaled Abou El Fadl is a bright light illuminating this sea of darkness, and it's a huge honor to be with him here today. This to talk about his magisterial magnum opus, Reasoning with God. Khaled doesn't remember this, but I was privileged to see a very early draft of this book in 2005 when I was just graduating with my PhD, and I was thrilled to see the final product, which is very different from the earlier draft that I saw in 2005. I'm honored to have my name on the back blurb of the book, and I was honored to review it in Critical Muslim, as Grace just mentioned. And I use this book, actually, when I travel to give talks. I take this book with me on overseas flights when I hate to carry heavy luggage, because I carry the hardcover. It adds to my travel, but it's worth its weight in gold because of the arguments and the analysis within the pages of this book. And I also use it personally during the month of Ramadan. I view it as a book that speaks to the soul and to the heart of a Muslim who has an ethical consciousness and is trying to understand and navigate this very dark reality that we're facing in the world today, both in terms of what's happening in the Islamic world, but also what's happening in the Western world with respect to the debate and status of Muslims. So, Khaled, it's a huge honor to be with you today. To talk about this book. I also want to just show for the camera, this is, if you look at my copy of the book, it's inundated with notes on every page, detailed notes that when I went through the book for the first time very closely for the review, along the margins, if you ever see the actual copy, there is up and down the margins little notes that I have. Question for Khaled. Question for Khaled. Question for Khaled. So some of those questions that I have jotted down were really waiting for an opportunity like this where I could actually have a chance to sit and talk to Khaled and ask him, you make this case in this particular page of the book. Could you elaborate and expand upon this argument? And so I've only gone through the first, actually, few chapters of the book and jotted down a number of questions. I'm hoping that perhaps at another time we can have another opportunity to go through the other aspects of the book. But let me sort of begin with one sort of big theme that is in the book, but also is related to what's happening in the Islamic world today, and it overlaps with one of your important contributions to diagnosing and unearthing and explaining the crisis of ethics within Muslim society, and that's your critique, your very eloquent and persuasive critique of the toxic effects of Wahhabism. The chapter on the book in chapter 8 where he talks about the background and the development of Wahhabi Islam and its toxic effects, I think is one of the most compelling parts of the book. I encourage people to read that section in particular. But when I was thinking about this chapter and the very negative effects that Wahhabi Islam has wrought on Muslim societies, I was thinking about the following argument, that perhaps you may have overstated the case. And the reason why I say that is if you compare what's happening or what has been happening in the Islamic Republic of Iran for the last 40 years, the official narrative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the official view of women in the Islamic Republic of Iran, the official laws within the Constitution with respect to women, music, aspects of beauty, minorities, is not Wahhabi Islam, but is Wahhabi light in many ways. I mean, I can go through the list and I can cite arguments from banning women from going to sports stadiums to preventing women from, enjoying any sort of public sort of manifestation of artistic expression. It's not as bad as what we see in Saudi Arabia, but it bears an uncanny resemblance. And of course, if you accept that as a fact, you can't trace the origins of this form of ugliness within the modern Islamic society to Wahhabism, because we're talking about Shia Islam. So how would you, respond to the argument that by blaming it all on Wahhabi Islam, you're overextending and overstating the problem here, because there are Shia Muslim interpretations of Islam that do overlap with these, puritanical interpretations of Islam that come out of Saudi Arabia? That's my first broad question for you to think about.
No, I think that is a very apt and valid question. I mean, if you will recall, in much of my critique, I speak about puritanical Islam. And what is common to the puritanical mindset is that, and I'm talking about Puritanism in the modern context, is that it employs the state, it weds itself, marries itself to the state, in order to speak authoritatively on behalf of Allah, and indeed it becomes speak in an authoritarian fashion on behalf of Allah. Now, of course, why did I target Wahhabi Islam and give it all this attention within the puritanical paradigm? Why didn't I just talk about puritanical Islam and deal with Wahhabism as sort of just a demonstrative example of the larger phenomena? The reason is that, part of it is historical, and I must admit that, is that when I first started talking about Wahhabism, there were no voices at all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in fact, within the most enlightened Sunni voices, Wahhabism was always seen as a reform movement that liberated people from the shackles of tradition.
Mm-hmm.
It was described by people even as reasonable as Fathi Osman or Muhammad Farid or not Muhammad Farid, the Egyptian Fahmi Huwaidi, yeah. Fathi Osman or Fahmi Huwaidi, or as a reform movement
Right.
that liberated the Muslim. So, but the impact within the Sunni world of Saudi Arabia in employing the considerable resources.
Right.
Now the other in propagating that theology, so that's sort of a sociological phenomenon that had to be called out.
Right.
So that's part of it. The other part of it is that the symbolism that comes from being in charge of Mecca and Medina, and the powerful normative power that comes from your this umbilical relationship with Mecca and Medina, and the leverage that comes from it. Now, part of the problem from a larger perspective, and from the puritanical, looking at it as a puritanical phenomenon, is that what is common to the Wahhabi way of thought, what is common to many Salafi ways of thinking, and also what is common to Shia thought in Iran, is that looking at Sharia and understanding Sharia not as a discursive process, not as a process of moral exploration into the natural order of things, and accepting that part of the divine majesty of Sharia is that it cannot be represented by a singular voice, and that it cannot be represented by a state, but rather taking the traditional epistemology of Sharia and then empowering the state with it to effectively close the doors of determinism. In other words, to say, well, this is the straight path, this is the way it is. That's what's common to all of them, and also all of these movements intellectually are anti-cultural and anti-sociological. They believe that human society can be molded to fit within the outlook of the way that Sharia sees the natural order. The way that the state sees Sharia. So, did I overstate the criticism? Intellectually, I would say yes. Intellectually, it is perhaps more accurate to just focus on puritanical thinking and the relationship between religion and the state. But part of the project was to try to loosen the power of the custodians of the sanctuaries of Mecca and Medina from their ability to speak on behalf of Islam uniformly, and to for the vast majority of Muslims, there's a sense of awe and surrender once that authority comes. And we even see it in the issue of Khashoggi today. I mean, there are so many Muslims that just say, well, you can't touch Saudi Arabia, you can't touch Saudi Arabia because of their status. Yeah, I mean, you know, part of it also, Nader, as you know, is a problem that modern Muslims have with history. You cannot take a body of normative explorations that were articulated in the medieval age that fit their legal determinations to what was historically made sense to them, and then take these texts and apply them literally into a modern epistemology, because the modern psychology will not accept it.
Right.
I mean, in the same way that you know, it was a non-issue for people within a certain time and period to see blood of animals, slaughtered animals. It would have no effect on them. I actually, you know, where I grew up, I saw that often.
Right.
And or to see the only way that you could execute people or kill people is through stabbings and or you know, through slashes or so on. Modern psychology has changed, and whenever you take a medieval epistemology and just apply it, you will produce a type of ruptures and tensions and psychopathies that resolve. And that's what's common to both Wahhabism and, you know, I'm not sure what the usul, what applies in Iran is Usuli Shiism anymore. I mean, it's more Akhbari Shiism.
Right.
For a lot of people said, you know, the issue is the Ahl al-Hadith people, the issue is the Hanbali, whichever way we diagnose it, we all end up in the same place. The need to understand Shariah as a moral order, but not a set of determinism that are trusted to the state.
Another question from your book. You've argued quite eloquently, and this is actually one of the arguments that you made in an earlier writing, but it reappears here in your book. And I remember when I first read it, I was sort of just completely captured by the argument, because I'd never thought of this particular problem, and it speaks to the challenge of interpretation, Quranic interpretation. How does one extract an ethical interpretation of Islam? And you've made the argument that, you know, the Quran can only be as moral as the reader.
Yeah.
That unless one has a sense and a commitment to ethics in one's life, in terms of how you deal with other people, you deal with society around you, if you approach the text without a broader, deeper ethical commitment, you are not going to extract an interpretation that will stand up to ethical scrutiny. Just a quote from page 12 of your book. You write, "The problem is that the Quran, as beautiful and sublime as it is first and foremost an educational text. And like all such texts, its moral achievements are contingent on the moral readiness of its students. As discussed later in the book, the Quran presumes that its reader has a degree of moral sense, without which the effectiveness of its message becomes limited. In the same way that a book of philosophy cannot teach its reader good common sense, a book of ethics such as the Quran cannot teach its reader to become endowed with a basic sense of morality. Intuitive moral readiness, or basic ethical awareness, like common sense, is not learned from a book, but is the product of psychological predisposition shaped by upbringing, culture, personal experience, and at times sheer determination."
Yeah.
So that sort of, I think, is just a brilliant observation, but it also raises the question that given the fact that the vast majority of Muslims today are living in under authoritarian regimes,
Right.
are living in developing societies where people are struggling to simply provide the basic necessities of life. They're raised in an environment, in a culture, and in an oppressive context where cultivating ethical predispositions based on what they learn on the school system, based on what they hear on television, based on the struggle for survival, is a tall order indeed. In other words, they don't have the freedom, the opportunity, the basic social safety net. So the question becomes, where does one, or how does one cultivate these ethical predispositions that are needed to be able to then approach a text like the Quran and then read it in an ethical fashion?
You know, I have become increasingly convinced that before one can be a good Muslim, one has to be a good human being. Mm-hmm. You know, before you can even talk to me about Islamic imperatives, Islamic norms, mm-hmm. Go learn how to be a decent human being first. Mm-hmm. You know, we can produce a lot of, there could be a lot of textual backing to this. You know, mm-hmm. As I say in the book, you know, the Quran constantly invokes these words that assume a moral sense, a pre-existing moral sense. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I think that one of the things that I point out about Wahhabism, because Wahhabism adopted this mythology, and not just Wahhabism, again, to your point, but many of the puritanical modern orientations, the mythology that our morals and our ethics, we come as a blank page and we have the Quran shape our morals and ethics. What often happens is that you end up with a vacuum that you fill through power dynamics. So in other words, subhanAllah, you know, as I argued a long time ago, and this was even before Reasoning Was God, I argued this in a book called And God Knows the Soldiers, that Wahhabism, by dealing with the Quran in a way that is unnatural to the text and highly artificial to the text, will end up at the end shaping Islamic mores and Islamic cultural norms according to, you know, class, race, ethnicity, colonialism. You know, you borrow, then you import whatever more. Before you can, you have to know how to be a humanitarian before you can be a good Muslim. You know, when the Prophet says that I came to perfect ethics, perfect, meaning that you are first a humanitarian, you are first a decent human being, and then Islam can build on that. But I'll tell you, even if one approaches the Quran without an ethical predisposition, the impact of the text could be quite corrupting, and could create schizophrenia. I mean, paradoxes that are not resolvable, or resolvable in ways that we see today. You know, you believe in you argue that you believe in the Quran, but yet at the same moment you embrace enthusiastically people who are openly Islamophobic and that attack Islam all the time and praise them as your allies and as your friends. These type of deep psychoses comes from these deep dissonance in the way that you approach the text itself, so that the text has nothing to engage. There's no hook. Now, but to your point, so what happens was, you know, I try to avoid pessimism. I try to think, well, you know, history. We saw in the Arab Spring, suddenly there was a social movement where people were, you know, saying freedom, social justice, and bread. I attended the short-lived discussions in Azhar after the Egyptian Revolution, in which there was a serious discussion for the first time, the only time that I ever saw any serious intellectual movement in Azhar, was a meeting in which the representatives from all the diverse intellectual trends came together, and they had, in the presence of Ahmad al-Tayyib, had a serious discussion about the relationship between humanitarian values and Sharia. And it came very close. Even the final statement that was produced in this meeting endorsed the philosophical position that humanitarian values are universal and that they come naturally and not derived from a textual interpretation, which was quite remarkable. Of course, all of that was rolled back. And we have to say, artificially rolled back, because we know now that the Emirates and Saudi spent a great deal of money, and they planned the coup with the Egyptian military, and that they intervened in Libya, and intervened in Tunisia, and intervened in Yemen. Of course, not to say, we shouldn't be deluded that a revolution would immediately create, it would solve everything. A revolution just simply creates opportunities for the beginning of the seeding of a process of humanitarian values within people that have been severely traumatized. And maybe it's unreasonable, and I don't know what you think. Sometimes I think maybe the margins of Islam, or what we think of as the margins of the Islamic world, which accurately they're not, like places like Indonesia or Malaysia, might be the hope that there's a greater, more vibrant intellectual movement there. But of course, we again see the effect of Saudi money there in a very powerful way, as you know from. I mean, I'm interested in what you think about this, because it's for once an intellectual, you understand the truth for what it is. But once you do, and you come to a conclusion like the quote that you just read, then comes the issue of, if you think in empirical terms and practical terms, then you're stunned. You say, well, there's no hope. If that's the conclusion, then humanitarian values cannot be seeded in a despotic environment, and you abandon everything, and then you just sit home and you isolate yourself. And so, I mean, but the role of an intellectual is to, in many ways, to dream. It's like saving Islamic manuscripts. Am I really, by saving a manuscript here and there, really going to save the tradition? But Allah created us where if we don't move, we die. If we don't dream, we atrophy. And so I don't know what you think.
Well, 2 points on what you just said. Most Muslims have this equation in reverse. In other words, most Muslims believe that if you have a problem with, let's say, a rebellious child who is not behaving well and is in search of some ethical guidance, just read the text, and then the text will tell you what to do, and then, inshallah, the problem of this rebellious child will be solved. But as you just said, and in the quote, if you don't have a deeper and underlying commitment to being a good person, a sense of right and wrong, if you approach the text, it could actually have the reverse effect. It could lead someone to extremism. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen a lot of these young Muslim kids in Europe and in North America joining ISIS, because the underlying discontent and anger is there, and they're given a text and they read into it a narrative and an interpretation that justifies their underlying anger and resentment, and it doesn't have the effect that most people. So that's, I think, one challenge. How do we approach in our interaction with Muslim communities? How do we sort of try and practically suggest ways forward that don't make the problem worse? And then there is, of course, the related question of what you just spoke about, context. You know, social context, political context, economic context. How do you inculcate and develop a humanitarian or ethical sense of right and wrong, separate from religion, in an environment where you are being oppressed, you're being forced to lie just to survive?
Just right.
You know, there's all these stories that, I mean, anyone who's lived in a developing society, particularly a repressive one, knows that if you want to get your passport renewed, you want to get your child into a bed, you've got to know someone who can manipulate or lie or break the law to your advantage. So I mean, there's a broader question.
And treat other human beings unfairly.
Just to get ahead, right?
Just to survive.
Yeah, just to survive. So how do you develop a underlying base level of ethical commitment? How do you become a good person when the social, political, economic context predisposes an individual to orient themselves in the exact opposite direction just by virtue of the desire to survive and to make ends meet and to be able to, you know, raise your family?
But, you know, when one of the most, one of the painful growing experiences when you as an immigrant, were you born in Canada?
I was born in Canada, yeah.
You were?
Yeah.
Well, so you're not an immigrant,
Yeah.
but you're son of immigrants.
Right, some immigrants, yeah.
So, but as an immigrant, one of the most striking things that when you, and this is, by the way, very old, because you know that Rafal Tahtawi had the same reaction when he said, oh, in France I saw Islam, that all Muslims and so on.
I thought that was Jamaluddin al-Afghani, but anyways, it's famous.
Yeah, it's a very strange
but it's a powerful quote.
It's a very powerful, yeah. You know, but one of the things is that you go and when you see people who don't believe in halal and haram,
Right.
and they do what is morally right,
Yeah.
from an internal impetus. I mean, even the fires right now that took place in Thousand Dogs. You know, when I compare the way my family in Egypt just had a major emergency crisis. Their home was invaded and stuff was stolen. They couldn't get the police to care. Typical, you know, attitude in Egypt. No one cares. No one has internal impetus to do
the right thing.
The right thing.
Right.
While you watch the way people function, for instance, in the fires today, and you find these people that truly, if everyone doesn't have the internal impetus, the disaster would be a million times worse. And people are doing the right, not just the right thing, but sacrificing their lives, putting themselves.
Yeah, the firemen right now, we're fighting the fire.
And this is a, you know, and for a historian, the big question is, how did these civic ethics, civic virtues, come to certain cultures and become inculcated in certain cultures? Because we also know that these ethics were not always there. I mean, we know that from European history that these civic ethics were not there. So how was it the process of bloody revolutions of the you know, typical class? So you get as well, you know, there were religious wars and there were bloody revolutions and there were all these despotism and executions and torture and you know, the horrendous punishment for accusations of treason in British law and French law. And then people eventually got tired of it and learned the hard way. Is that a convincing answer?
No, it's a great question. I think I think you're on the right track. I think there's many different, my own thoughts on this, just off the top of my head, is there's many different avenues that have fed into this particular state of affairs where people, broadly speaking, let's just take firemen right now who are in California fighting a fire, why they're motivated by a sense of commitment and ethics, despite coming from a civilization and a background, as you just said, that has a history of violence, discrimination, brutality, corruption. I think my own sense is that a lot of it has to do with the benefits that flow from a culture of democracy, a culture of transparency, accountability, the rule of law tradition, but also, there's also reservoirs of, ethics that flow from Christianity, from Judaism, from, people who are raised in a broadly Christian society. You go to church and there's been a development of a particular interpretation of Christianity and Protestantism, and later in Catholicism, that is geared toward, an ethical understanding of the world.
It's a civic, partly aided by the civic virtues that are consistently preached in Christian churches and Jewish synagogues, and there are, of course, exceptions where you have the crazies.
Of course,
but the mainstream, and I think that's what we sorely lack in Islam. And while I understand it in dictatorships, it pains me when I see it infecting Muslims in the West as well.
Right.
To be able to attend khutbahs, and khutbahs then cite text, as if text can define the moral order. So when Allah says, "Ahsinu inna Allah yuhibbul muhsinin," do husn, because God loves those who do husn.
Right.
Well, it could be. It's remarkable that people can recite that, and yet it doesn't revolutionize their moral sense.
Right.
And this is a very good example of how it assumes a moral predisposition within you, so that you understand what Allah yuhibbul muhsinin is. That muhsinin, it means you can't be rude to your mother, you can't be rude to your father, that you have to be a decent human being with your spouse, that you have to be a decent parent, that you can't drive in a way that ignores the rights of other human beings, that you can't take bribes. All of it encompassed within this simple expression. Without that, the biggest thing, this goes back to the puritanical mindset, whether you call it Wahhabism or Akhbarism or Ahl Hadith. When people then say, okay, well, I want to know what muhsinin is, and I'm going to read examples of historical practice to define what ihsan is for me. So when you find then a story about, like and a good example is this Khashoggi thing. One of the Saudi sheikhs came up and said, well, Khaled Ibn Walid was once in Hurub al-Ridda, in the apostasy wars. He captured a fellow and then he executed him. And he executed him because he thought that this is what the Khalifa wanted. But it was wrong. It turned out the Khalifa didn't want him executed. And so he apologized and he paid the diya, and so what's the big deal? When you use the tradition in that way, the tradition is only legitimates stark power and nothing else, because there's no bedrock of values that it rests on.
So so the deeper question is, we could go on for hours on this, is how do we in Muslim societies and Muslim communities develop that bedrock commitment to ethics, which is a requirement for building an ethical understanding of Islam?
I'm really. This is a question that I struggle with all the time. We know that these civilizational values that built civilizational phenomena in Islam, that they were anchored initially not by Ahmad ibn Hanbal and the Ahl al-Hadith people and so on, but by the liberty and freedom that came from reason and rationality, and the importation of Greek philosophy and the wedding of Greek philosophy with Islamic norms, and I'll say the dirty word, and the contributions of the Mu'tazila to our understanding of justice and the norms of justice. So, do we need a movement in which we reclaim, like till now, it amazes me that the rationalist justice-oriented school like the Mu'tazila remains in dirty world in modern Islam. It boggles my mind. Do we need the moral courage to say we have to reclaim the thought of schools like the Mu'tazila, and we have to identify the unhelpful effects of orientations, the textual orientations of Ahmad ibn Hanbal? I mean, do we need to fight this historical battle, or is this approaching it the wrong way?
Well, I think that has to be part of a larger development in a culture of freedom, where we can have these debates and discussions, a culture of tolerance, of debate, of openness, of intellectual exchange, where these ideas can be, can be discussed among Muslims. If you go to the Muslim world, most Muslim societies, a public debate along these lines in the public sphere is impossible. Because all of these authoritarian states want one particular interpretation of Islam to dominate, and they crush anyone else who has a different point of view. So forget most of the Islamic world, except perhaps the countries that you mentioned on the periphery of Southeast Asia.
I was attending a conference about Ash'ari, and I suggested that it is time that we reinvestigate the Mu'tazili thought as a serious contribution. If I wasn't an honored guest at the time of Sheikh Al-Azhar, I would have been kicked out. They actually they cut off, they turned off the podium and wanted me. Do you remember? You remember that? I started arguing with them.
It was a red line. It was a red line.
I got very offended. I said, no, I have to continue. I have to finish my lecture. And they said, no, sit down, sit down.
I mean, the other related point here, just to push it a bit further, is that I don't think, I'll relate it to you. I don't think it's a coincidence that you have developed this incredibly important ethical understanding of Islam, and that you were able to benefit from your education in the Islamic world, but also your education and your existence in the West, where you benefit to attending some of the best universities in the world, where they have very high intellectual standards, and you were able to, write and think and debate in ways that contributed to the person that you are. And so the point that I'm trying to convey is that I think it's much easier to be an ethical Muslim and to have that bedrock foundation of values in an environment where there is a freedom to think, to debate, to experiment, to make mistakes, to explore different intellectual currents, and not be, and then also to have it at a deeper level, just to be able to, live a life where your basic socioeconomic needs are taken care of, where you don't have to steal and cheat. So I'm saying, in other words, it's much easier to be an ethical Muslim in the West, with all of its problems and shortcomings and, negative trends that we're seeing right now, than it is in most Muslim societies, because there is an atmosphere and a foundation of some socioeconomic sort of, equality and a safety net, broadly speaking. I mean, the United States is sort of on the margins of this. I come from Canada, so I'm sort of, biased here. But also, you have a choice of mosques, like in Toronto, even though most of the mosques, as we know, are, let's put it, charitably, leave a lot to be desired. But at least there is, at least in the Toronto that I come from, there is this center that I played a small role in establishing called the Noor Cultural Center, where you have debates, you have conferences. The sad reality is that for most young Muslims today, growing up in any major Muslim community in the world, even in the West, that if you want to understand something about your religious heritage, the chance of doing so, especially in the Islamic world, are very narrow. You're just going to go and hear the official state preacher, and he's going to, or you go to the local mosque, and the interpretation will be very unethical and rigid and in many ways unhelpful. So unless you have that broader context of democratic freedom, then it's very difficult to develop any sense of ethics, in my view. Not that it's not impossible, and I'm not suggesting that there are no ethical Muslims today, but but in order to sort of think deeply, I think one needs the environment, the social, economic, and political context to have that opportunity to develop those underlying, humanitarian values that can then lead you in hopefully a better direction. The other related point that sort of is relevant here, you just had this meeting with Noam Chomsky,
Right.
and so I've told this story to many people. Growing up as a Muslim in North America, it was pretty clear from a very young age that those of us who were politically conscious, aware, upset about the state of politics in the world, but particularly in the Islamic world, were looking for mentors. Mm-hmm. That we, people in my circle, gravitated and were deeply inspired by people who were simply deeply ethical, deeply moral, deeply on the side of the oppressed, deeply in many ways enunciating and pursuing Islamic values, even though the vast majority of them were either atheists or agnostics. So someone like Chomsky, openly, if you read him, he said he's a radical atheist.
Right.
But he's one of the most moral people, in our world today. I mean, he's not perfect, and I've disagreed with Chomsky, but broadly speaking, his legacy is one that, among the group of Muslims, I would often refer to Noam Chomsky as a Muslim. Not as a theological Muslim, but in terms of how he, his commitment to justice and his commitment to ethics. And so it's an interesting observation that at least the Muslims that I grew up with, it was a very small group of people, most of you who you've met over the years, because I brought them here to introduce them to you and them to vice versa. These are people who, look for people who have an ethical compass, and they tend to be people who, are not practicing Muslims theologically, but their ideas, their writing, their commitment to social justice is very Islamic. And conversely, the group of Muslims that I grew up with, when we would go to Muslim conferences, go to the mosque, go to the Jummah khutbah, it was, oh my God. We actually, I don't know if I told you this story, there was a moment in time where the Muslims that I was a part of, a very small group in Ottawa, Canada, reached the conclusion that in order to strengthen our iman and be better Muslims, we should not go to Jummah prayer anymore. Because what we were hearing week after week was not only, intellectually alienating, it was just ethically, we couldn't relate to it. It was just, it had nothing to say about ethics. It was just, the standard sort of khutbah that you hear, unfortunately, in too many mosques today. It's all about ritual, all about some things were just disconnected with the real world, which was exploding in our face, which was, and so this is part of this is related to this question of ethics in Islam.
But it's really, you're touching upon so many of the, in order, it's the same, it's the same, old debate about whether Allah would support, Allah would ally God's self with those who are just, regardless of whether they're Muslim or not,
Right.
as opposed to those who are Muslim,
Right.
regardless. And so, it's substantive justice versus tribal identity,
Right.
and this, it's amazing because when you do have a Muslim that the ideal, it's sort of the dream, the thing that you long for is a Muslim that has a strong sense of justice, but at the same time is a practicing Muslim,
Right.
a Muslim that has reconciled within herself or himself
Yeah.
between Islam as a passionate call for justice. It's the same thing with my call for beauty. And I use beauty quite intentionally because I want to challenge the notion that objectivity, absolute objectivity, is needed for us to pursue moral aspirations. I mean, beauty is a moral aspiration, but as long as you have a longing for that moral aspiration and you are not satisfied with where you are morally, so you critique yourself,
Right.
then you have a dynamic process that goes somewhere. But on the mention of khutbahs, it's quite remarkable. I would hear forever that the congregation in the Islamic Center of Southern California are dead fish, meaning that when you give the khutbah and you look at people, they all look like they're dead fish. Meaning, so I started giving khutbahs about morally pertinent issues. Khutbahs was a moral compass, talking about torture, talking about Khashoggi, talking about Jerusalem. And suddenly these dead fish came to life. For the first time, the dead fish actually resonated in the khutbah by speaking, instead of, no one was on their phone, everyone was very alert. But institutionally, right after my last khutbah, which I consider to have been probably one of my best khutbahs, because it got about 50 people after the khutbah came, and it was, you get the obligatory contact from the institution telling you this was bad. We don't want you
too controversial.
Not even controversial. Said,
unacceptable.
You just, it was not. You didn't teach people Islam.
So let me stop you right there. Now, that's not coming from Saudi Arabia and other authoritarian groups which want that type of brain-dead Islam. It's coming from people who think that the advice they're giving you to tone it down is Islamic advice, is Islamic authentic advice. So how would you explain that particular reprimand that you were given after you gave that Friday prayer sermon?
I mean, we keep going back to, and it really, whether Islam is like a liberation theology that is a passionate call for justice, and that or Islam is like a yoga practice which comforts you in the marginality of your life, but doesn't do much more than that. So I mean, because all of us can, especially if you're wealthy and you're well off and you're financially taken care of, and then you could hear a khutbah about how you should read Quran every day, and you read a few pages of Quran, and you thank Allah for all of the blessings, and Allah take care of my children, and then you feel good about yourself, and that's the Islam that you want. And because Islam as a passionate call for justice is where the heart of Islam is to challenge racism, to challenge classism, to challenge all types of persecutions, to challenge inequality. It's unsettling for those who are already quite comfortable for life, and comfortable in life. For the bourgeois, and I have, the only response I can give is that the Islam that you want is an Islam that is born dead. It will, your children or their children are not going to grow up Muslim. And I don't believe it's Islam of the Prophet. I mean, if the Prophet had stood for anything, he stood for a revolutionary movement.
But then that speaks.
Injustice.
But that then speaks to sort of some basic issues in terms of how Islam is taught and passed on from generation to generation. If you can't understand the Prophet Muhammad as someone who stood up for justice, who challenged entrenched power, who opposed racism, who believed in questions of peace and reconciliation, and had an ethical compass when it came to, if you don't teach those basic themes to your children and your grandchildren, then it raises some fundamental questions about Islam. Just for many Muslims, the ones who reprimanded you, seems to be just a bunch of pietistic sort of rituals and slogans and statements that have no connection to the real world and the relationship between human beings and the struggle to create a just society. It's just a complete sort of disconnect that undermines the actual legacy of the Prophet
But,
Muhammad.
it didn't become sad because it didn't. Marx is right that it is the opiate
Give
of
the
the
masses,
masses.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if Islam is that ritualistic, pietistic, then it's an opiate, and
Yeah.
it's an opiate that
Yeah.
people take in order to tolerate injustice and ugliness. So something like Khashoggi can happen, and then you go and you do your prayers and you feel that, oh, it's fine. I don't have to trouble myself with the murder. I mean, even I'm deeply. Do you know, as we're talking right now, there are 12 Shia Saudis who are about to be executed.
Yeah, they're on death row.
Yeah,
One of them
death
a
row.
prominent woman. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they might be put to death
as we speak.
as we speak, and it for me, the fact that my fellow Muslims don't lose sleep over something like that, because at least at a minimum, it's like when what do you want from us? What I want is that at least you acknowledge the outrage, that you're upset about it, that it troubles you, that it makes you not want to eat, or that it makes you want to spend your money and do it, or it makes you want to support whoever speaks for the truth. It bothers you.
Yeah.
If it doesn't bother you, then Islam is an opiate for you.
Yeah.
And Islam as an opiate, it's like all opiates, whatever their ideology is, I'll say it, is evil.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the sad reality that we're facing.
And I can't have Islam be evil.
Yeah, of course, How much time do we have? We have to take a break.
We should break to pray.
Break to pray. Okay, so let's break to pray and we can pick it up maybe afterwards. Yeah. Okay. We have to take advantage of the time we have left since time is fleeting. So I have one big question, and then like you said, we'll go to Q&A. I strongly believe, Khaled, that we have to connect our questions as much as possible to the real world in which we're living in, and challenges and controversies that Muslims are grappling with. But now in a globalized world, these problems are global problems. They're not just
They're no longer
right.
Muslim problems.
Exactly. Although how we approach them, I think, and how we resolve them depends on the context and the audience that we're dealing with. But I want to connect a contemporary problem that's in the world, in the news right now. It's deeply, I think, painful to watch this happen. I suspect you know about it, but I want to connect it first with something that you've written in the book, because this passage in the book illuminates this contemporary problem that's in the news today, and everyone is sort of talking about it, at least those who care about human rights. You say in the book that the worst injustice and the one most worthy of Muslim outrage is an injustice committed by Muslims in Islam's name, because this is more deprecating to God and God's law than any supposed heresy or legal infraction. It is out of concern for the sanctity of their own religion and tradition that one would imagine that Muslims would be most boisterous and vigilant in protesting injustices committed in Islam's name, whether against Muslims or non-Muslims. And this has to do with what you talk about in the book, the Muslim covenant with God, and the moral responsibility that goes with that. And so there's an issue in the world today that has made a lot of news. I'm not sure if you're following it, but I want you to connect this particular passage and provide some thoughts, guidance, analysis on how conscientious Muslims should deal with this particular problem. And this is a problem that keeps happening. Every few years there's a similar issue. So I'm referring specifically about the case of Asia Bibi in Pakistan. This story that, for those people who haven't been following it, this Christian Pakistani woman who 8 years ago allegedly, over some altercation, committed an act of blasphemy where she used the Prophet Muhammad's name in some disparaging way. She was picked up, put in jail, charged with blasphemy, and recently she was let out of jail. Her case was, I think, reviewed, and she was exonerated from the charges. And so for the last several days in Pakistan, there have been these massive millions of people on the street in the name of Islam, screaming and demanding her murder. And Pakistani politicians are all completely scared. They're all fearful of what's happening in the street. Her lawyer has fled the country. This woman is somewhere in hiding. the new Pakistani government refuses to defend her basic human rights and support the verdict of the court that exonerated her from any wrongdoing. And you have these newspaper articles and reports, and you see these people giving speeches, and in the name of Islam, in the name of Islamic authenticity, demanding that Islamic justice, according to this interpretation of Islam, necessitates the murder of this woman, the death of this woman. And so this is, a story that, has been replicated in many cases. And so, of course, this is music to the ears of Islamophobes, right? They take this and they'll say, well, see, look, we told you so. This is Islam, And of course, conscientious Muslims, ethical Muslims, I think, struggle with the proper response, because these people on the streets calling for the death of this woman are claiming and invoking Islamic authenticity, and they have their clerics who quote, Islamic sources to say, well, this is the punishment for someone who allegedly is engaged in blasphemy. But at the same time, I think ethical Muslims know there's something deeply wrong, deeply problematic here, deeply wrong. And so, how would you advise ethical Muslims watching this particular case, which, as I said, I can mention half a dozen other similar stories that reappear. How do you navigate this particular problem in Pakistan, and this particular, I think, what I would call, abuse of Islamic tradition to violate the rights of this woman, in a way that is, in keeping with God's covenant, as you sort of articulate, but at the same time, also speaks to the broader human concern over what's happening in the Islamic world today, with respect to human rights and the status of women.
I mean, it's amazing because you always pick the quotes that are sort of the heart of the project of reasoning with God. I mean, the entire book is reasoning with God, meaning how do I use my reason, acknowledging God as my partner. And as you know, it's a journey full of insights, but also a lot of pain and a lot of critical self-reflection, and even confessions. I mean, in many ways, it's also a confessional book. Okay, so let me say that there's one way that I would handle this if I was this woman's lawyer, and there's another way that I would handle it from the position of the public position that should be adopted by a Muslim. So, if I was a Muslim, if I was a woman's lawyer, I would talk about the technicalities of the law and why, as a matter of instrumentalities and mechanics of Islamic law, in fact, she does not qualify, even within the traditional classical paradigms, as an apostate. And so, if you want to use the tradition as your rubber stamp for your sense of outrage, it's quite remarkable that Muslims, like Muslims in Pakistan, can live in a country in which sexual abuse within families is rampant, and can live in a country in which the U.S. comes and at will bombs targets with a complete, and they don't feel a sense of outrage and humiliation at that. They don't feel a sense of humiliation and outrage at the way women are sexually victimized. They don't feel a sense of outrage at the way that there are these constant reports that people are using their cell phones to film assaults against women and posting it on certain websites on the net. and then this is what
That's
outrage.
That's the
that
heart of
they-
the matter. There's so many injustices and abuses taking place in Pakistan, but this issue
but
rallies people, millions of people coming to the street.
We can understand it from a historical perspective. You know, we understand. There's a very good book that I forgot the name of the author that talks about how the evangelical movement in Asia during the colonial era.
Beth Barron.
Beth Barron, that's right. It sparked the creation
orphan
of,
scandal.
Yeah, the orphan scandal. It sparked the creation of the Ikhwan,
Right.
the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
And if you look at a lot at the satanic verses and Salman Rushdie affair, you know, we have someone like the Iraqi poet Maruf al-Rasafi who wrote things that were completely heretical. No one cared.
Right.
No one demonstrated. Maruf al-Rasafi continues to be celebrated as a poet, but because it didn't tap into the colonial legacy of its empowered memory and the sense. But I'm not saying this to excuse it. I'm saying this to understand it.
Exactly. Yeah.
For me, every time there is a perception that someone has insulted, apostated from the faith, it taps into this patriarchal, male-dominated sense of disempowerment and frustration at being fundamentally subjugated to the and lacking self-determination, lacking the autonomy, and instead of directing it towards greater democracy, greater autonomy, greater self-determination, is directed in these highly symbolic and false fashions. But let's be very honest about it. What contributes to it is the way that our tradition itself is understood. We must have an honest conversation and discourse about the part of Shariah that, or the part of the fiqh tradition that was born out of an imperial reality. There was an empire. There were a lot of the jurists were also judges, and they worked within the understandings of the mechanisms of the state at the historical moment. And we cannot deny that at the same time that they wrote what they wrote about apostasy, Roman law in the crimes of Maestas and Maest punished what was equivalent of disloyalty to the person of the emperor in the most savage fashion. The same was under English law. In fact, it was drawn and quartered for even just disobedience of her. The same was in Jewish law, where crimes against the high priests of the temple were punished by death and stoning, and so that was the imperial context in which these jurists found themselves. And when they approached the text, they approached the text within the epistemology of that imperial reality.
Right.
Now, the honesty is to come and say, well, that's all fine and good, but this imperial reality is no good for us today. And it is what could have passed as moral at that historical moment is deeply immoral in our moment. And the fact that we are subjugated and we feel our sense of pride is broken, because all Muslims have their sense of pride deeply hurt and cut. The fact that our sense of pride is deeply ruptured, it means that we must direct our energies towards venues for empowerment and dignity, to confront our oppressors, to confront the Sisis of the world, the Assads of the world, the what's his name, MBSs of the world. Instead of doing these things, I mean, look at what and I say this, look at the amount of damage resulted from the reaction of so many Muslims to the satanic verses. All the demonstrations the irony of it, in Pakistan, there were all these demonstrations.
Yeah.
The only people that died in the demonstrations in
Yeah.
Pakistan were Muslims.
Right.
So Satanic Verses became
A bestseller.
a bestseller.
Right.
It continued. It became a literary classic.
Right.
Although on the merits, I
Yes.
think it's probably the worst that he's written.
Right.
Well, he wrote a novel after that
Yeah.
that's even worse.
Yeah.
But you know, it's not. You can't compare it to Midnight Children, for instance,
Right.
which was actually really good.
Right.
Muslims turned him into a star, and he continues to live and thrive.
Yeah.
So you know, it reminds me a lot when one of my shuyukh used to tell me, you know, the worst thing about Egyptians, and we can generalize this about all the Muslims,
Right.
you know, even say Egyptians,
Yeah.
is that Egyptians when they're upset at their nose, they cut off their ear
Yeah.
to spite their nose.
Right, yeah.
And I think all the Muslims do that.
Yeah.
You know, we can understand there isn't a you know, that we all feel a sense, and I'll be very blunt about it, a sense of degradation because of we don't control anything about our faith,
Right.
or we see the level of disempowerment and the amount of injustices that surround us, and we can do nothing about it. But for it to come out in this highly symbolic but yet immoral postures, and I don't think there's any space anymore for not confronting the immoral discourses of our clerics.
Yeah.
Because these play the ultimate role in legitimating a situation in which we are constantly bankrupt when it comes to civic virtues.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of like literally like a constant drain
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
whatever civic virtues
Right.
develop,
Yeah.
and a constant ongoing source of alienation towards any intelligent moral elements that rise in our society. I mean, so when you find, for instance, the Supreme Muslim League of Jeddah issue a statement about Khashoggi in which, you know, they say it is the obligation of all Muslims to stand by the king and MBS, and because they are the representatives of Islam, and they condemn the bombing of the church in Egypt, which is good.
Right. Yeah.
But they have nothing to say about
Yeah.
situations like this
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
I think all of us, unless we challenge, unless we challenge these clerics and say, you know, your Islam
Yeah.
is not
Yeah.
the Islam that we are willing to believe in,
Yeah.
we are going to be at a stalemate. When we play nice with these clerics, when we accept positions to be members of the council of this league of fuqaha or this league of Muslim scholars or that league, and go attend conferences and play nice and play polite, I think we just exacerbate the problem. I mean, of course, the problem, as you know, Nader, is that this requires a sense of daring and even a sense of be willing to be thrown to the margins during your lifetime, because that's exactly what happens.
Well, in the case of Pakistan today, it's actually much worse. To sort of challenge these clerics who are calling for the death of this woman is to literally risk your life. I mean, her lawyer has fled. The government, with all of its army, is scared of these street protesters. So it's actually much worse than what you're stating. If you wanted to, within Pakistan today at least, offer just a dissenting point of view, just to say, you know, maybe this call for the death of this woman is not the Islamic thing to do. Maybe there's another way of looking at it. Even that, because it's so tied up to what you just said, the identity and the sense of humiliation and degradation, and this has become the way that at least this group of Muslims identify and express their Islamic authenticity. It becomes a dangerous proposition for anyone who wants to challenge the position.
And that's.
And that's real.
I mean, you know, I would like to believe. I would like to believe that if I was in Pakistan, I would challenge it and take the risk of dying for the cause. Because I've said this a long time ago that unless there are equal number of people willing to die for what is good,
nothing will change.
Nothing will change. Of course, you know, no one should just simply say, oh, you know, I would be because you don't toot your own horn. That was a Allah tells us, don't commend yourselves. But our attitude should be, our attitude should be one where you say, in principle, I would be willing to stand for what is right, even if it costs me everything. And I know how difficult life becomes. In many ways, to be honest, death is a mercy, because if you just die for it, but to live with what follows from it is often very, very difficult. I mean, I know a lot of academics, Islamic study specialists in Pakistan, and I am sure that's why I haven't heard any of their voices, because of just this sheer terror. But how long has terror been an element, a factor of our life since the age of nation states? I mean, it's like you can't function morally when you exist with terror. But yet terror has been the primary illness in Muslim society. And if we want health, eliminate the factor of terror, or mitigate terror as much as you can.
Well, this speaks to the earlier conversation that we were having. Unless you can live in an atmosphere and a society free of terror, where you can intervene in a, let's say, debate like this and not have to fear for your life, unless you have the opportunity to live it, then there's no way of bringing about change.
You know, one of the things that, just your comments, I'm not a social media person, but because of the New York Times article, I was forced to go on social media, and I was checking, I ended up reading all these comments about, recently Trump had a confrontation with a reporter from CNN.
Right, Jim Acosta. And then they doctored the video to make it seem like he assaulted her, and that whole story,
but I was reading the comments by Arabic comments on that event, and they were fascinating because, hundreds of comments, but practically all of them saying the same thing. If this would have happened with any leader in the Muslim world, the journalist would be gone. The journalist and his family, so while the U.S., there are a lot of people outraged at the behavior of the president. In the Muslim world, saying, God, they don't realize how democratic Trump is.
Exactly, and everything is relative, right?
But that's severe. That's so sad.
It's a sad commentary.
It's deeply sad.
I mean, there's other people who have questions here. They've been sitting patiently, and I'm told that there's other people online who have been...
do you want to moderate that?
So Grace, do you want to take over now and maybe just give the floor to other people?
So in the interest of time, what we'll do is just have a couple of questions, put forward, and then we can let our esteemed guests or host answer. So let's start, and then let's start here first, and then we'll see if there are some online questions. So who would like to? Anthony?
I have two questions. One's brief and one's kind of longer. Dr. Khaled, I was wondering if you've ever thought about digitizing some of the manuscripts you've gotten, just because, I'm sure they're pretty frail. And I know, for example, that this is something that the Buddhists, I think the Theravada Buddhists are looking into. They're already doing it, like they're digitizing some of their manuscripts just so that if, God forbid, like they get burned in a fire, like they're preserved. And then my second question, I guess for both of you, is you guys have talked about a lot about the dislocations in the Muslim world, but I was wondering if you could comment on the role of converts here in the West, because although there are dislocations in this society, it seems like we don't have the same ones, and so that moral sense that is supposed to be innate, that enables one to garner something from the Quran, hasn't been tainted, I guess. So I was wondering if you could comment on the role of Western Muslims and converts in particular, because my sense is converts, we don't really have those dislocations unless we learn them from certain elements from the Muslim world. Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on that, say a few words.
Is there a second question? Sorry.
Can I just about digitizing the manuscript, because that's I am severely dependent on help offered and proffered. If someone that has the financial resources comes and says, I'll create a fund so you can hire some graduate students to digitize all your manuscripts, I would be ecstatic. You can't teach an old, what is that expression?
Old dog.
Old
dog
new
new
tricks.
tricks.
You're not gonna get me to become comfortable with technology to the point where I say that they're just thank God I can even figure out email, sort of, to an extent. And I don't carry cell phone. I started getting into iPads just recently. So my point is just, I keep praying to Allah all the time that Allah would send people who would be willing to help preserve the library, because I do have manuscripts that are literally irreplaceable if they're a single copy in the entire world. And by the way, the amount of intellectual, this is again another thing we Muslims are not good about, is the amount of training and knowledge it takes to create one intellect that even knows what is a rare manuscript, what's not a rare manuscript, who are the copyists, what copies exist. It's really an investment of generations. And we Muslims, even when such an intellect exists, we waste it. It's sort of like, oh, okay, well, that's nice, let's move on. And that's just a severe tragedy. Okay, I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say about that.
I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. This is the Khaled Abou El Fadl Usuli Halakha, and I'm here to listen. So my question, my interest in this meeting is really to learn from you. So I have some thoughts I would offer on the topic, but why don't you go first and try to speak to the question of Muslim converts and the different historical background that exists.
My experience with Muslim converts, and as limited as it is, because the tendency is that for people to convert and then sort of they interact for a period of time, and then in my experience then they feel alienated and they disappear, and keeping track of them is not easy. But my experience is that in fact they do come to Islam with sort of an innate, what I call humanitarian values. And in fact, initially what draws them to Islam, not all of them, because there are some that just come to Islam because they already suffered from serious social pathologies, and they think of Islam as a faith of anger and vengeance, and so. And I'm not talking about this group of converts. I'm talking about the converts that come to Islam because they think Islam is a faith of justice and a faith of equality and a faith of rejection of racism and rejection of and that initial beautiful moral insight is often quickly corrupted by the interaction of converts with migrants. And migrants then rush in with their texts and their hadith and their arrogance and their haughtiness and
their Wahhabi influence.
And their Wahhabi influence, and they start twisting the psychology in these converts. And so that is part of the impetus for the Usuli Institute. The dream, of course, it's sad that everything is dependent on resources, but the dream was to create a space in which converts would create an association in which they would be able to have conversations like the early pioneers, like the early Sahaba, with sort of the humanitarian values and the basic understanding of Tawheed and the implications of Tawheed, and not have the immigrants with all their breathing down their neck. Of course, so far right now this seems like such a faraway dream, because Grace is keeping track of people who contact us, and we get a lot of converts to contact Grace, but mobilizing people into, ideally, you would organize some type of major conference, the first convert conference in the U.S., which I think would be. But ideally, you would pay their tickets and pay their
expenses.
I think they had one, but I think it was by Why Islam, and I don't know if that's. I think they're kind of Wahhabi.
Yeah.
Is that the Ahmadiyya community?
No. This happened. I think. Where was it? I think where the IOK is, wherever that is, Diamond Bar. Is that where the IOK is? I think so. Yeah, there. I think this was like last year, but I don't know how well attended it was.
Yeah, I mean, it really pains me when I see converts that very quickly they start becoming like transmitters of medieval tradition, and the intellect changes to a medieval intellect, and medieval epistemology is not modern epistemology. It's a completely different epistemological framework, and it's unnatural. Psychologically, I think it's contrary, and this is, subhanAllah, I mean, we are all raised with the idea that Islam is the religion of fitrah, of intuition, but the most counterintuitive thing you can do to a human psychology is to come and force it to live in an epistemological framework that is reactionary to its historical moment. It becomes twisted immediately and unable to cope. And this is exactly, by the way, what I think happens in Iran and happens in Saudi, and this when you hear some of the clerics talk about how there's an obligation to obey the ruler, and you can't even criticize the ruler and open sort of these medieval frameworks of absolutist monarchies and absolutist claims to power, and that the ruler is avoidance of fitna, so that you don't question the ruler in any way in public. A medieval mind and a historian can probably understand it, but for a modern mind, with everything that it's exposed to, it will create a social pathology immediately. And so, I don't. What do you think about converts?
Look, those of us who've been hanging out in the Muslim community for a very long time, I think have similar experiences when it comes to converts. You know, you'd be involved in some Muslim group and then somebody will introduce, oh, brother Bruce has just converted to Islam, and or brother Ian has just joined us, and there are different categories of Muslims who convert. Some of them, the ones that are most impressive immediately, are those who've come to convert to Islam because they've researched and studied other religious traditions, and they found in Islam something that really speaks to their inner being, and they understand Islam from a comparative perspective, and they've made a decision. But there's other groups of Muslims that I think all of us have seen, and you just alluded to it, who convert to Islam, but they're coming as converts because they have some trauma in their own backgrounds, and then they embrace Islam and then reproduce it in an almost like cult-like fashion because they think that's what it means. And in many ways there is this argument among converts that because they've converted, they have to be overzealous and over sort of strict in the interpretation because they've converted. And so that's a, you know, that's a group that, you know, I can recall, that I've encountered, and perhaps that sounds similar to, you know, maybe your experience. But when I think about converts in the American context being different than the dislocations that affect most Muslims in Muslim majority societies, I'm immediately reminded of some of the more famous Muslim converts in the United States who really stand out and deserve, I think, admiration. And immediately I think of Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, who converted in the pre-Wahhabi days, right? So you could sort of see, like when Malcolm X at the latter phase, when he breaks with the Nation of Islam, he goes to Hajj, he comes back, he's deeply connected with issues of racism, discrimination, and injustice, and the global sort of power dynamics. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to live that phase of his, and then the same with Muhammad Ali. I mean, his conscientious objection to the Vietnam War, his principled position on questions of racism were inspired by his understanding of Islam, which was then translated into, you know, an intervention on issues that mattered for Americans during the time when he was alive.
That's true. Yeah.
And so you see those converts coming out of using Islam and seeing Islam speak to the questions of injustice and discrimination that were, you know, very unique to the African American community. Then you have, you know, another famous convert of Islam who all of you know, and growing up in the Muslim community, this was a big deal when I was a young Muslim, and it was announced that this famous personality had converted to Islam. And you know, we were taught that this is the example that all Muslims should look up to, and I'm speaking specifically of the case of Cat Stevens.
Oh, no. So
when Cat Stevens, you know, converts to Islam, and now he's talked about this, and he has a new book out called "Why I Still Carry a Guitar," and he talks about his story. And he converts to Islam. He says, "I didn't know many Muslims, but I went into the main mosque in Regent Square in downtown London, and I went and I met the local imam there, and I told him that I was interested in Islam, and he was studying spirituality, and unfortunately, in Cat Stevens' case, the local imam there was a Saudi-trained imam in a Saudi-funded mosque, and the imam tells him that, look, if you want to be a Muslim, you got to put all that music away. The guitar is haram, music is haram. And I remember, you know, this being in the Muslim community that I was being raised in. Oh, look at Cat Stevens. He was this musician. He's given up his music, and he's become a really true Muslim, and you young Muslims should try and emulate him. And then I remember vividly when I was a university student, he came to Toronto where I was living, and he gave this talk, and it was a big deal because of his reputation. And he comes into the room, and he reminded me immediately of sort of a member of the Taliban. Really austere, really sort of, presenting himself as a holy, righteous person, and gave a talk that was just so bizarre. I remember it. It was called. It was about his talk was called. I think it was called Ibadah, the key to destroying the shaitanic world disorder.
Dang, that's
And his analysis was that, look, the reason why we're having problems in the global system is because Shaitan has gone into the head of Reagan and Gorbachev and told them to do all these things, and you have to practice your rituals and be a good Muslim, and if you just, stick to the text and the rituals, you will not fall into the trap of Shaitan. And, the room was full, and, people were listening to him, but thankfully, for whatever reason, if you follow Cat Stevens or Yusuf Islam's trajectory, he's had a moment of reassessment and rethinking of his Islamic commitment, and he's come to realize that this claim that somehow music or playing the guitar is haram is completely bogus. And he explains it in this book that that's the only Islam that he knew. He went to this Wahhabi mosque and they told him, and so he gave up the guitar for 30 years and started preaching a form of Salafi Wahhabi Islam. And now he's back playing his music, writing new songs, playing his old songs, and speaking to packed audiences. And during the course of the songs, he'll talk about being a Muslim, about why the song "Peace Train" matters, and reaching an audience of people much wider and much on a global level. And if you look back on this whole story, Cat Stevens's conversion unfortunately happened in a way that I think isolated him for 30 years during the prime of his life, when he could have been, had he been exposed to, I think, a more ethical interpretation of Islam, he could have been much more influential. Thankfully, for whatever reason, he's had he's had this change, and he's, I think, still a practicing and pious Muslim. But now, rediscovering, saying, look, actually the guitar was brought to Europe from Andalusia, and to claim that somehow music is haram or un-Islamic has nothing to do with the historical evolution of how these ideas, came to Europe. And in many ways, he was making an argument that, the guitar is very Islamic and very sort of authentic in terms of its cultural manifestation and transmission. He was inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he talked about, still being a Muslim and why these songs matter. And so there's that sort of experience of conversion, which unfortunately went in a wrong direction for 30 years, but thankfully, for whatever reason, he's come back to, I would argue, a much more ethical understanding of Islam. But not all these converts do that. But I think the Cat Stevens case is really a problem that you were alluding to. It's like you convert and then you get sucked into this sort of immigrant community and exposed to a Wahhabi interpretation, and you think, well, what do I know? In his case, he actually didn't know, because he said that when he converted, he actually knew no Muslims. He just knew this imam in the Regent Square Mosque, and then he was surrounded by, unfortunately, the Muslim scene in Britain, which was influenced by these these really these unethical teachings, let's say, and that's the path that he pursued for 30 years. So, I'm not sure if any of this answers your question, speaks to your question, but those are just some of the reflections that I have about when I think about converts and I think about the background that they have. I mean, I think it's very difficult for someone to convert to Islam and then still maintain an ethical commitment to Islam in the way that you've written about, separate from your engagement with the Muslim community, because the Muslim community, you go to the Jummas, you go to the, you go to the Halakas, and it's all sort of this very retrograde and sort of fossilized in medieval Islam, right?
Right, yeah.
And so you think, well, I'm one person. I've joined this community. I want to be part of this congregation, this assembly, this group. What am I supposed to do as a lonely Maybe this is authentic Islam. And so I think the best instincts that I think a lot of these converts sometimes bring to Islam then get zapped and get sort of just crushed.
Yeah.
And instead of us benefiting from, I think, the converts and what they bring to Islam, they get suffocated.
That's why, or creating some type of, there has to be an organizational response, and we have to break. One of the saddest things is that, when people talk about a commitment to Islamic principles and all that, but they don't break the race barrier.
Yeah.
And that's deeply problematic to me. I mean, it's ironic that if you're a ibadah, it doesn't transform you into a relevant human being, into a beautiful human being, and I always use that. Then your ibadah is really between you and God, and it's no relevance to anything.
Yeah.
I mean, other than to your private relationship with God.
Yeah.
But interestingly, that harkens back to why I chose to overstate the case about Wahhabism. It's because
Its impact, its impact is much greater. Yeah, absolutely.
factual.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Any other questions here? Go ahead.
So, one of my favorite parts of reading Reasoning with God was the chapter on kind of the history and the construction of Wahhabism. And I kind of have a obsession with this topic, having grown up in that type of environment and having to kind of rewire from it. And you mentioned how the job of an intellectual is to dream and kind of imagine solutions, something that's not yet existing in reality. And Wahhabism has existed for what, like little more than 200 years? And I feel like from what I got from those chapters in Reasoning with God, it's kind of tainted almost every school of thought in Islam. It's been tainted in some way or influenced. Even the Shia school of thoughts have been somewhat influenced, as was discussed earlier. So since you can't really, history moves in like one direction, you can't really undo that or like a reset button. So moving forward, would you say that it's possible in the next 100 years, next 200 years, to sort of offset and kind of balance things out back to a sort of ethical framework and general mindset?
I mean, of course, I mean, it's really interesting because Wahhabism has been recently dealt a severe blow in that and I don't think Wahhabis themselves have yet awoken to this reality. The Crown Prince, MBS, has forced Wahhabis to, one took honestly the best of the Wahhabis and threw them in prison. The Wahhabis that had a sense of values that might make Wahhabism continue to be relevant, and threw them all in prison. And the ones he left outside the prison are all the ones who were forced into such contradictions, like switching their fatwa about music or switching their fatwa about driving overnight. And so a serious issue of credibility has come up, and then has forced the Wahhabis Imams to say things like the Palestinians are worse than the Israelis, the Shia are worse than the Israelis. So in other words, to completely betray Palestinian rights, to completely betray Jerusalem. Now, these political positions that Wahhabi Imams have been placed in deeply compromise their credibility. Now, what is the fallout from that is going to be very interesting, because my guess is, I mean, what I think will happen is that it will not be too long before even MBS, the Crown Prince was all his recklessness and so on, realizes that you're going to have to forego, if you continue in the same course, then you're going to have to forego all the influence of Saudi Islam outside the borders of Saudi. Because Muslims are going to sympathize with the Palestinians and not with some Saudi. They're going to sympathize with Jerusalem and not with some Saudi sheikh that tell them forget. Muslims are waking up to the genocide that is taking place in Yemen, and the fact that Saudi sheikh are sitting there and saying, oh no, it's all wonderful and no problem. But what is the fallout of that? What is going to become of Wahhabism? Does this create space for people or voices like me? Does it effectively, I mean, in a sense, I have to say, I feel like things that I've written in 1998, when I said that Wahhabism dooms itself to secularism, that I told you so.
Yeah.
It actually happened.
Vindication.
And it because it has no space to navigate so it ultimately ends up making religion just completely, it puts it in a boutique and shuts the doors on it, and religion becomes entirely irrelevant to anything that has to do with life, and that has happened now. But what makes me hedge and what makes me not unreservedly optimistic and say, oh well, better days are coming, is that money. Saudi Arabia still has a lot of money, and one thing I've learned in life is that there are a lot of people that are willing to do all types of cartwheels because of money, and money is just it has amazing power, and so.
On that line, we've gotten this question several halaqas ago too. But so, are you willing to answer the question? Should Muslims then boycott Hajj?
Yes. I've been waiting for this.
Because the money.
The issue of Hajj has become, and I'm so hesitant about this because I'm in love with the Prophet and everything, where the podium of the Prophet. I mean, the love you feel is. But I am deeply. Let me just put the case. I'm deeply troubled by the fact that where the Prophet, ﷺ, home used to stand, where he lived with Khadija, there are toilets now. Yeah. When you go to the bathroom, where the women's bathroom now is, that's exactly where the Prophet ﷺ lived with Khadija. Now, if I were, how can I go to the restroom in Mecca, and I know that where I am going to the bathroom, this is where the Prophet ﷺ lived with Khadija? How? The thing you now see when you go to Mecca is the big clock that is higher than the Kaaba, that overshadows the Kaaba, and you feel that this is like an idol created for the rulers of Saudi and for the corporate businesses that and all the corporate merchandise in Saudi. Mecca is not, the Kaaba is not the center anymore. The other thing that deeply bothers me, the treatment of Rohingyas in Saudi, the incarceration and now forced repatriation. Well, actually they're being sent to Bangladesh, but the abuse heaped on the Rohingyas, the prohibition or the preventing of Qataris from doing Hajj, the abuse heaped on Yemenis that have opposed the Saudi or United Arab Emirates, anyone who has even spoken against Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates and their genocide, if they dare go to Mecca or Medina, they get arrested and they disappear. Now there are all these reports that Palestinians are being denied the right to Umrah or pilgrimage, and the insistence that the pressuring of Jordan to give Palestinians Jordanian citizenship to make the Palestinian issue, and this is in agreement between Saudi, Egypt, Emirat, and Netanyahu, and pressuring Jordan to basically make the Palestinian problem go away. Right. Now, on top of that, the fact that anyone that has spoken against Saudi or even was active or spoken even against Sisi in Egypt, opposed Sisi. They go to Umrah or go to Hajj and they disappear. I mean, I know a number of Egyptians who didn't even ever say anything about Shariah. They were, and no one knows what happened. They did their Umrah, did their, and then as they're leaving, they disappeared in the airport, and we can't even, you know, rumors are they were handed over to the Egyptians, but we don't really know. We don't. All of this makes me say, and I say this for everyone hearing me with deep, that as a moral human being, I cannot go spend money, put money in the pockets of people who every single day sully and degrade the holy mosques. And because of that, as a conscientious matter, my conscience would not allow me, regardless of the sacrifice and the cost, of getting a visa from them when I know that they use the issuance of visas politically, and then going and spending money in corporations and businesses that they use for very corrupt and un-Islamic and unethical purposes, and to ignore the suffering of the Rohingyas, the Yemenis, the Palestinians, to ignore the fate of Quds, to ignore the relations with the Israelis, and to go and put money so that I can stand in the Kaaba and say, Allah, please do this and do that. I don't know how Allah can answer my prayers. If you are doing your Umrah or Hajj on unethical basis, then Allah will not pay any attention to your prayers. And we must understand that. You know, ours is not some type of unethical or immoral or moral neutral God. If that's what you believe, then might as well not believe in a God. This is a deeply morally anchored God that who rewards morality and punishes immorality. And so I can't pray under these circumstances in the Kaaba. I cannot as a moral person do it. Now, those who feel similarly, my advice to them is that no, but if someone tells me, can I as a moral person go and do Hajj or Umrah, I would say, I would see it as contributing to injustice. There, I've said it.
I mean, it's a very difficult question to pose, because one of the 5 pillars of Islam is obligation.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, as Khaled has just said, that we are living in, you know, very unique circumstances where to fulfill your obligation to uphold that fifth pillar is to contribute to, you know, the perpetuation of injustice. So it poses a dilemma for believing Muslims. Yeah. But anyways, how are we doing on time?
I mean, and I resolved the dilemma by saying no, because the ritual for me, the ritual. How can you fulfill a ritual when it is at the cost of disastrous consequences with the entire ummah?
Yeah, of course, yeah. But actually, this is actually a very important moral debate for Muslims to have. I think it illuminates a lot of the contemporary dilemmas of what it means to be a Muslim in this moment in history.
And I think, and actually, I would love to have, like, again, if the Usuli Institute was a forum, to have an entire conference where you actually have a free debate, and to hear pros and cons, and to hear free arguments about this. And then people can make an informed, moral, conscientious decision based on all the evidence. But you know, from everything that I know at this point, and that's a conclusion I have to reach. It's deeply troubling. I mean, when you're in Mecca, you have to use the restrooms. You're forced to.
Yeah. What do you do? Yeah.
But not, and not, it's not just the house of the
Yeah.
Prophet ﷺ, because they
Yeah.
just destroyed everything.
Yes,
I
yeah.
mean, when I went, one of I went in the 90s, and I saw there was the companions had, I didn't know that this existed in Medina. They had dug like a swimming pool. And I was amazed. I was like,
Who dug the swimming pool?
they say that they attributed back to the companions. Now I don't know.
Oh,
if
at
it
that
goes
time,
to the,
yeah.
the archaeologist I was with, he said no. This is actually it's not a swimming pool. It was like a bathing
Yeah.
spot.
Right.
So, but then when I went a few years back afterwards, it was gone. It has been raised. And and even areas where they were like these very small structures, or maybe the size of this rug, where reportedly Abu Bakr and Umar would, or each one of them during Ramadan would do their khalwa in, so it was close to their home, but
Right.
it was in a separate structure.
Right.
And again, these were demolished. You're not just erasing sanctity, but you're erasing history. Because what
Yeah.
historians can learn from studying structures like this is invaluable,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's gone.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think a greater crime is what's done to the Palestinians, or what's done to the Rohingyas or the Yemenis.
Yeah.
Because these are, you know, when report the hadith of the Prophet that the blood of a Muslim is more worthy in the eyes of God than the world and the entire universe and what's in it. You know, how do you reconcile between that?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to exercise my moderator's right to ask a question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Thank you so much. This has been so illuminating. I think that one of the most powerful parts that I got from your conversation is that you have to start by being a moral human being, regardless of your label. And we all know people who are beautiful Muslims that are not Muslim. And I think that because the two of you are very special and unique in that you understand the importance, and you talked about understanding our time, our age, our context, the things that are important for us. And so we clearly live in a time where, you know, technology is central to the way people operate. We've had a lot of knowledge systems completely altered, so people don't read books, they rely on the internet. Scholars have lost their place of respect among Muslims. And any idiot can pontificate online on the same footing as the two of you. And and what you said about your friends recognizing that if we want to stay moral, we should not go to khutbahs anymore. I mean, I think that obviously is going on today. So given just the shakeup of everything and the uniqueness of our epistemology in our time, what advice do you have for young Muslims or Muslims that are searching, that are critical and ethical, but feel like a lack of confidence in their faith? Where do we start to rebuild? Because I think so much of why things don't happen is a lack of confidence. And like we can sit here and talk about how Muslims need to be outraged, they need to go do this, that, and the other thing, but oftentimes it seems like, how can I, as an individual, go do anything like this? Right. I'm not empowered. I'm not part of a group. I don't have money. I don't have the knowledge necessarily. I mean, so where do we start with, given the challenges that we face today, in helping build that foundation of ethics and giving people the permission that they need to become like moral agents that are worthy of God? your teachers. So what do you tell your students?
I will defer to.
No, you can't. No, you have to say. You have to start. This is. It's too tough.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm sorry, it's a difficult question.
No, I mean it's actually a very good question because I think in many ways it speaks to the heart of the dilemmas and the challenges that at least Muslims today are facing in North America. And let me just begin with a few thoughts, and I'm hoping that Khaled then can pick it up and expand upon these thoughts. You're absolutely right in framing it about lack of confidence, because I think a lot of Muslims who are raised in Muslim families, and then they're in the world and they're living in, they're living in multiple worlds. They're living in the world at home. They come from a Muslim background. They have a sense of ethics. Then they're living in, the broader secular world, and they're pursuing jobs. And when they look at their religious heritage and they're looking for some ethical content and substance, most of the interpretations that they have are ones that are very devoid of ethical, moral substance. It's more of, just go to any Jummah khutbah, it's all about rituals. It's all about, have you thought about the akhirah? Have you thought about the day of judgment? So the Islamic resources that Muslims have are very few and far between. I think the only advice that I would give is that for those Muslims who are searching for something deeper, is you have to, in the age of social media, develop some sort of deep commitment to reading diverse sources. One of the big things that inspired me was when I discovered the work of Fazlur Rahman, the late university. The sad tragedy of Fazlur Rahman is that, ask contemporary, even from Pakistan. I've had many conversations with Pakistan. They've never heard of him. They've never heard of him. They've heard of. There's another Fazlur Rahman in Pakistan who's one of these hot-headed preachers. They've heard of that Fazlur Rahman, but they haven't heard of his ethical. They haven't. They haven't read Khaled's work. They haven't read the work of other. So I think if someone is interested, if they're lucky enough that they have a certain aptitude toward reading, you would hope that they would eventually discover these works, which would then provide them with that. But that presupposes that there is an individual there who has access to resources and has the time and commitment to read. If you don't have that, then gradually what happens is, I think a lot of young Muslims understandably just give up, because when they even if they go online or even if they go to the local mosque or bookstore, all the books there overwhelmingly are books that that just reinforce a certain intellectual lethargy and for lack of a better term, sort of mental confusion that doesn't help. In fact, it perpetuates the problem and perpetuates disillusionment. Then the other thing I would offer is that it helped me a lot, and I'm incredibly lucky looking back. I was lucky where there was a handful of Muslims in my circle. We had the same set of interests and grievances and concerns, and we formed a group, and we organized events, and that's actually how we got to meet, because when the first time we met is when you came to Canada to give this talk for the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, and it just so happened that I knew Alia Hogbin, who is the long-standing president, and was looking for a speaker, and I sent her some of Khaled's writings, and she thought they were incredibly powerful. And so forming yourself into groups and just getting together in a halaqah such as this can often produce very positive unintended consequences, because people then start to debate, to exchange views, you read things, and then something good might come out of it. Other than doing those two things, I see no way out of this dilemma. It's up to the individual, and you hope. Sometimes you just get lucky, you just meet someone who introduces you to Khaled's writing, and it inspires a transformation. But other than that, I don't know what the way forward is.
I mean, because permission to think is very important, and I completely agree with phrasing it that way. The permission to, and it's not even permission. The permission to ask questions, because that is really the questions. The permission to and not the answers are actually. To be able to live with questions and not feel like you're betraying your faith, and not feel like you that it somehow it compromises your piety, or sometimes it somehow makes you a traitor to your faith because you have questions. But you know my reading, when I look at history and the way that ideas catch on in society, every society that becomes anything in terms of building civilizational values and building civic virtues and so on, it has a lineage, and not a single thinker, but at least a number of luminaries that it draws inspirations from. I mean, it goes back to this very basic thing that talent. I mean, in the past, I gave example with classical musicians like a Bach or a Mozart, but in the context of thought, a Kant or
Schopenhauer.
Aquinas.
Aquinas, of course, long before Kant.
Kierkegaard.
Or Kierkegaard. They're gifts. They're and a society that the key is that when to search for these people and to read them and not be shy about saying, well, I drew this idea from this source, because we Muslims, we tend to have this tendency to not value intellects, and it's the youth feel alienated, and the intellectuals feel alienated as well, because they're not celebrated, and they're constantly not given their and that's a two-way waste. It's a complete devastation. One of the books, for instance, that I thought never got the attention it needs, but actually I think long time ago we talked about it, or talked about the guy who wrote it, was a book called A Faith for All Seasons.
Yeah, Shabir Akhtar.
Yeah.
Faith for All Seasons. Yeah, that was a transformative book in my own experience.
I mean, I've met very few Muslims who've read that book.
And what's so brilliant about the book is that it sort of demands of Muslims to engage with the challenges of secular modernity and to come up with ethical and moral Islamic responses that the challenges of secular modernity pose. And if you can't do that, he says, then you haven't earned your right to be a Muslim.
I mean, but it was the most brilliant thing about that.
And it was a book that, unfortunately, I accidentally discovered. Someone said you should read this book, and I remember reading it very closely. I read it again recently, last year, before I went to Malaysia, where I had to give a talk on a similar topic. And it's one of those books that I would put, one thing that practically that can be done, I think, on your website, put a list of the top 10 books that a thinking, conscientious Muslim should engage with. Mm-hmm. This would be one, but I would say books that are not just written by Muslims, but there's sort of, or maybe you can have a longer list of sort of this is something that if you are interested in, understanding the contemporary dilemmas of the Muslim world, these are the top 10 books. This would be one. Now, obviously, this would be at the top of the list, but that would be, I think, a contribution to bringing about political change. Yeah, so those are good ideas.
It's like how we've wasted, or Fazl Rahman is not sufficiently recognized. But I would say that Shabir Akhtar is another. I don't know if he's even still alive.
He is actually. I'll tell you after the cameras are stopped rolling the update. But actually, I'm impressed that you actually remember we had that conversation.
Yeah, because the book had a big. The book had an impact on me, and then the conversation we had stayed with me because since we've had that conversation, it was many years ago. I have been, I would ask students and ask, have you even heard of this book? And
no one has.
No one has.
Yeah, part of the problem is that it was published by Ivan R.D. Publishers. Has anyone even heard of that publishing? It's an obscure Chicago publisher. It came out in 1990. But what's so interesting about the book, just he wrote it when he was 30 years old.
Very young.
Very young. I mean, so there's a brilliant mind there.
Yeah.
You know.
But we have an knack for wasting brilliant
Yeah.
minds or alienating them.
Yeah.
As a quick follow-up question, because we live in a time when if you post something on social media
Yeah.
and then everybody jumps up and says,
Yeah.
where's your evidence and
Yeah.
what school and what this
Yeah.
and what that,
Yeah.
but you know as quickly as they ask that question, even if you gave them the right answer, they would have no clue.
Yeah.
And there's no way for people to even, they're using like this tool of authenticity that
Yeah.
they don't even understand. Would you argue for even throwing all of that away and going back to fitra, as you mentioned? And just the sense that, because if someone at 30 years old can say, the whole point is just to figure out what is the most ethical, beautiful way to deal with the challenges of our age. I mean, that's fundamentally Muslim, right? No one, you don't, even if you don't read a book,
Yeah.
you would just know from your heart
Yeah.
what is morally beautiful, and isn't that enough? Would that put us in a better place, that if you can't read and you can't?
Okay, I'll tell you, what my sense is, given if what you're saying sounds immoral to me, then the burden of proof is on you, not just to convince me that this is that there is probable evidence, but that there is clear and convincing evidence that what is intuitively immoral is what God wants. And so my attitude is always, I have a right to speak from my moral sense. Now, if you're gonna pull legalese on me, then you bear the burden of proof, and just throwing a hadith or a Quranic verse that could mean this or that is in itself insufficient, because the higher the moral issue, the bigger the moral issue, so for and that resolves a lot of questions, because I always notice that people have twisted things on its head, where the burden of proof seems to be on anyone that it's the other way around. It's not on the person who's trying to it's like if you tried to talk common sense, they tell you, well, where's your burden of proof? Well, I don't need a burden of proof to speak fitrah. That everything's permissible unless otherwise proven. But then I'll add this: given a choice between an oppressive law, I mean, I value the tradition because I know that all meaning is created through communities, cumulative interpretive communities that build upon each other. Even our sense of morality comes from community. However, if the cumulative interpretive community leads to an immoral disposition, then it must be abandoned. So, the same, like for instance with slavery, right? Can you anchor yourself on an interpretive tradition to say slavery is part of Islam? You can, on an interpretive tradition, yes. But should I accept any amount of evidence that slavery is a part of Islam? Absolutely not. I don't care what interpretive tradition you have. you know, and I would have a crisis of faith if, in fact, Allah came and said, "You shall have slavery in your society," because as a moral Muslim, I don't think that's an impossibility. Allah cannot. It is not possible. It is like saying 1 + 1 can be anything but 2. It is not possible that Allah would command something that is ugly or unjust. And that goes back, you know, to this issue about the Mu'tazila and so on. It is such an impossibility to me that one's ethical thinking leads me to believe that herein is justice. To convince me that this is contrary to Allah's will is such a high evidentiary standard that I cannot imagine it being met. I'm not, you know, I wish I could just answer the question in this straightforward. And then here I really, you know, I cringe when I hear people wanting to throw away the entire tradition. Because I know that usually when we throw away the past, we don't replace it with anything better. We usually replace it with something worse. But at the same time, the tradition, as you know, it does exercise its suffocating influence upon people, and destroys imagination and creativity and ingenuity.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why your contribution is so important, because the challenge of Islamic reform is precisely to try and figure out what part of the tradition do we keep and what part of the tradition do we throw away, and how do we bring about a new synthesis. And so that's a Herculean task. It sort of necessitates as a precondition that you know the tradition, but also that you have an ethical approach to the tradition, because if you don't have it, then you get into these debates like you just alluded to, and I've had this debate, and you probably, I recall having a debate with some Muslims over the question of slavery, and they're saying, no, you can't say that slavery is banned, because it's in the Quran, it's in our tradition, it might come back again. And they're so committed to sort of that narrative.
They say that Muslims support that.
Yeah, and so this speaks to a deeper.
You have someone that says, "Well, the Prophet had slaves."
And so this speaks to, I think, a deeper crisis of ethics where Muslims are so, I mean, maybe literalist or puritanical. I don't know how you want. They're so committed to holding on to that understanding of the tradition, but not an ethical one that can sort of, and partly, you know, we can understand why Muslims, because there is a certain comfort in a certain dogmatism and in a certain rigidity in saying, look, the text is there and we have to sort of bow down to it.
I mean, the irony, the whole project of reasoning with God, the entire purpose of that book is to exactly try to because I talk about the issues like proportionality and burdens of proof, and I try to work through, and I have this long thing about this conversation that I had with Arkoon. And Arkoon, because Arkoon's attitude was that we don't need the tradition, and I talk at length in there about my meeting with them and conversation with them, and how I was arguing with them that actually no, it would not be a good thing to throw away the entire tradition, and sort of this carving of a synthesis. The problem is that it's very difficult for a Muslim intellectual to get read, and this is not just unique to me. I think this is for all of us.
Get read where?
I mean, by Muslims.
By other Muslims.
Yeah, by other Muslims. I mean, to be serious, and I mean the irony is that you have non-Muslims that read your work and they engage it, and they then use your thought process to inform their own tradition.
Right. But not internally, within
but not internally, and that is I mean, and I think that's the product of the historical moment that we live in. I mean, I have to believe that this is not a permanent thing. That, you know, we are not raised by our parents, or most of us, to say, you know, don't speak unless you've done your homework. Or, you know, if you can try to answer the question yourself first by doing your homework, and then if in fact we're raised with exactly the opposite, to shoot our mouth off, and not to respect the idea of doing homework. I mean, you know, it's like when you get students from all Muslim countries, nearly without exception. I actually, without exception, I'm thinking whether Indonesians and Malaysians are exceptions, but I'm not sure. The vast majority of the Muslim world, they don't know how to do research.
Yeah.
You know, it's like
There's no training.
There's no training. They don't know how to write a research paper.
Yeah.
And then when you ask them to write a research paper, they really
Struggle. Yeah.
they really struggle, and you have to teach them. What does it mean to use 20 resources and not copy any of them?
Yeah, right.
And then when you say you have any paper you write, you have to offer original analysis.
Right.
All my students that come from the Muslim world freak out the minute I say it has to be original.
Yeah.
They
panic.
They panic, and you sort of have to. And I think that has to do with the educational system, and again, the nature of dictatorial society.
Of course, yeah.
Yes, and I hope you'll come back again, because I think that there's so much more that can be said as really valuable. I want to give you an opportunity to have any closing comments. Or
No, I just want to thank all of you for starting this this Usuli Institute.
I can say this, that Nader Hashemi blessing us with this visit. I value it tremendously, because this is one of our Muslim academics who just is a gift to the Ummah, and we don't celebrate our intellects and our intellectuals, and we don't celebrate the intellect as the way we can. I mean, I don't know the center that you had in Denver, right? Yeah. I would be surprised if the financial resources would come from Muslim venues.
They don't.
They don't.
So you're right. Yeah. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Khaled, for being here.
Thank you so much.